Hello, and welcome to Chapter 5, The Rise of Rome and its Republic, 753 to 44 BCE. Now, we did discuss in class last time, but let me go ahead and reinforce this for this chapter. What we're doing in the next two chapters is going back to the same time period that we just discussed in the last two chapters. So we were discussing the Greeks. We began with the Dark Ages, which was roughly around the same time that we're beginning in Rome in the 700s, right? So we go from that Dark Ages, throughout the Hellenic Age, that time period of the Athenian Golden Age and all that good stuff. And then we went over the Hellenistic Age, and we're going to see those two chapters really overlap with chapter 5 and chapter 6 in the Roman world. And we're going to see a lot of overlap in general because these two cultures were obviously always in contact. We see the sharing of similar symbols, art forms, gods, etc., etc. So there's going to be kind of a lot of overlap, and every here and there, some of the things that we talked about in the last chapter and in the chapter before that are going to pop up again, but we're going to see them from a different perspective, the Roman perspective. So when we saw, issues over food production in the Greek world, um, because of Sicily being taken over. We're going to see in this chapter Rome fighting the Punic Wars over Sicily for that same reason. So we see that same kind of event from two different perspectives and from two different places in the world. So this is something to keep in the back of our mind, that we're going back in time a little bit, but we will catch right back up to that time period by the time we reach chapter 7. Now, there's going to be a lot of things in this chapter that will likely be familiar to all of you as U.S. citizens and citizens of the Western world, because many of our traditions we get from Roman and Greek culture. We've already noted some of the things from Greek culture that would be familiar to us, ideas about the polis and radical democracy that we saw in Athens is definitely something that our founding fathers kept in the back of their mind as philosophes or philosophers of the Enlightenment. But they also had a very historical perspective on Rome themselves and used many of the social, cultural, political, legal, and economic systems that we saw in Rome as a kind of a guiding point for our own. You can see here in our pictures we have buildings that would look very, very Roman and are very, very Roman. And also a little bit Greek, because the Romans got a lot of things from the Greek, including all those lovely, Ionic and Corinthian columns, right? We get those from the Greeks, but the Romans very much like doing things a bit bigger than the Greeks did most of the time, outside of that lovely Athenian Gold Age under Pericles, when he was, getting all of that money and embezzling it into Athenian public works projects. But we're going to see a lot of things that would be familiar, especially linguistically, because a lot of our mottos, right? A lot of our country-based and military-based mottos come from Rome and from the Roman military tradition and legal tradition. We see this with Semper Fidelis, always faithful, right? The motto, as it were, of the Marine Corps. We also see this with E Pluribus Unum, from many comes one, that notion of our multiple colonies making one larger society. This was a popular motto as well in Roman times. Many of our legal traditions are very much steeped in Roman law and Roman law measures. Although we'll see a few differences, most especially when it comes to the Romans' expectation that all laws would be simple and easy to read, because that would make it possible for all Roman citizens and even non-citizens to follow Roman laws while they were in that culture. We'll see that with the 12 tables. So we'll see a little bit of variation because, let's face it, our laws are anything but easy to read and understand. We've definitely developed more of a lawyer class, but as we'll see when we enter into the Roman Empire, that actually becomes a bit of a tradition for Rome itself. But we shouldn't, and that point illustrates that we shouldn't mistake the people of Rome for ourselves. Although we have many traditions in common and we borrowed many ideas and cultural concepts from Rome when framing our own constitutive selves here in the Western world, we are not and should not consider ourselves too terribly similar to the Roman people. We have obviously some very, very different concerns and some very different cultural connections. So something to keep in mind. Similar, but not the same. I mean, we see this most especially with the evolution of the fasces, and that will illustrate another point that we're going to make here in a moment. This stick of bundles or bundle of sticks would wrap around usually a colander of some type that would have a scroll inside of it, usually that would give a law, a directive, an order, etc. And an axe would be attached to that. The idea would be that a soldier, an envoy of the kings from the Etruscan times, would carry that to their various vassals and vassal lords under those early kings, and give them orders and arrangements, and they would know from the fasces that this person was a traditional envoy of the kings. Under Roman law, that tradition continued, although the fasces evolved a little bit. It became a little bit bigger and more complicated, and we'll see that in the Roman world, bigger equals better is going to be a trend that we'll see the more we enter, especially into empire. And that would still be carried by envoys of Rome, especially when they went out to various ends of the empire as Rome expanded. So they could carry official business and have it be recognized as official. And we see that to this day in many United States buildings. Many people see this fasces and is unaware of what its meaning is and what its origin was. And if anybody is a fan of World War II history, you'll also recognize the fasces as one of the symbols of the fascists in Italy that they picked up because they were hearkening back to their traditional heritage as Etruscans and Romans, right? So this was a way of them kind of accessing this idea of heritage. But it's also a way for us in the United States to acknowledge our heritage as people who claim many Roman traditions as our own. And something to keep in mind about the Romans is that they really were a blend of a lot of different cultural influences, right? Because it wasn't just the Roman world, because you notice in that map, really when Rome began under the Etruscans, it's just this kind of like tiny little dot on this really long peninsula, right? Or really, it's a tiny little dot over here on a really long peninsula. It's not a very big place to have such a large and an expansive Roman Empire come out of. It starts really small, but really it's ideally situated as it is in the Mediterranean on that peninsula along major trade routes. And it's that position that allowed it to rise in power because it had such a great and advantageous spot for trade. But it also gave them access to a whole heck of a lot of cultures, right? And we definitely see this reflected here. So we see the Etruscan influence, right? The Etruscans would be those early kings. Not a lot is really known about this early period of the Etruscans. We're finding out more and more as time goes on, but one thing that that we have to keep in mind with the Roman world is that it expanded very quickly and it built on top of the ruins of those Etruscan kings. So, you know, those old Etruscan cities with their old Etruscan ways were really built on top of by the Romans, and then they were built on top of later through the modernization projects of Italy when it became unified, you know, in the early modern period. So we don't really know too terribly much about the Etruscans, but we do know some things. We know that they exported a lot of luxury goods. We also know that they gave the Romans many of their musical instruments. They were very well known for musical instruments. And it's rather likely that musical forms in the Roman Empire evolved from Etruscan musical culture. We also know that their idea of divination, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we talk about the private space and religion, but kind of the use of auguries and auspices to predict the future, to understand one's place with the gods. These kinds of things were highly, highly influenced by the Etruscans, who believed in things like using the entrails of birds and hair, because those were the two best, because they were psychopomps. Psychopomps is a form of God that carries messages from the land of the living to the dead, or between human beings and gods. Mercury is a psychopomp, for example, because he carries messages between the earthly plane and the plane of the gods. That birds and rabbits were able to access the land of the gods. Rabbits were one of the only animals that it was believed could go into the underworld, and birds it was believed could fly to Mount Olympus and thus be able to meet with the gods on the earthly plane. So they would take apart these animals and look at their guts and see what they could find in terms of what the future held, what bad omens were there, what did we need to avoid. We see this with Julius Caesar and the Ides of March, right? That idea that he was going to die on the 5th of March was an augury. It was a bit of oracle work. So the oracles used auguries. So they used these bird guts to give him an idea of when he could expect to die, and they were apparently quite right, or at least that's the way the legend goes. We know that they were very intensive traders, and that they really believed in urban planning. They're one of the first folks during the Dark Ages to really start planning their cities more extensively, and that's why at times you see a little bit more urban planning in the early Roman world than you did in the early Greek world, because of the Etruscan influence. Now, additionally, we have the influence of Greek and Mediterranean culture, and it's probably pretty obvious to a lot of people what these influences are, the gods being a big one, the gods and religion. And it's not just the Greek religion, not just the Greek gods, which were renamed by the Romans. So, you know, Zeus becomes Jupiter, Hera, you know, becomes Juno, etc., etc. These small changes, though, did not really change the essential nature of these gods. However, it should be noted that there's kind of different meanings in different gods that were more important to the Romans. The Romans really loved the god Mars, because Mars is tied to their origin story, as it were, the origin story from comic books, right? The origin story for Rome comes from, you know, Romulus and Remus and the support of the god Mars, or Mars Volta. And we're going to see how important that is with how many temples that people erect to the god of war, because really Rome was birthed in violence, as we see with the story of Romulus and Remus, which may have been a symbolic interpretation of Roman people throwing off the early reigns of the king and establishing the republic. It's hard to say, But your author does certainly make a interesting case for that. And when we have our documentary where we watch about the rise of early Christianity, they'll also make that argument. Now, we also see a lot of Greek traditions of language. Although the Romans speak their own language, which is an Indo-European language, that being Latin, all good Romans learned how to read Greek. If you were a richer Roman, if you wanted to be in a political office, it was expected that you would learn Greek. It should also be kept in mind that Greek is still going to be, for a very long time, until we almost reach the age of empire for Rome, when they really start expanding past their borders. Greek is going to be the language of trade for much of the Mediterranean world. It is the preferred language of trade. We already established that, right, when we were talking in chapter 2, when your textbook author discusses what it was like for somebody from Egypt traveling in another country, having to learn how to speak Greek because that was a language of trade. So that language was very influential on their culture. And so too was a whole heck of a lot of other things. One thing that we definitely see is that Spartans were to the Romans the best of the Greek people, because the Romans loved Greek literature, they loved Greek art, they loved Greek sculpture. They loved Greek sculpture so much for many, many years, they didn't make any sculpture themselves. All they did was take statues from Greece and plaster cast them and then recast them in bronze because they preferred bronze because they thought it was cooler, shinier, etc., etc. That's what they would do. So they weren't even, for many years, making their own sculptures. They were taking them from Greece. And what we also see, though, is that although they liked a lot of the art and the philosophy, etc., of Greece, they didn't think that Greece was as militarily manly as they could be. And in fact, that was what was the common complaint that Romans waged against the Greeks. The Greeks could be great if they weren't so feminine. They would often say they were a bit feminine. They weren't militarily disciplined enough. They saw the infighting and the competition that city-states had with each other as problematic to Greek power, and they had a pretty good point sometimes, as we saw with the Peloponnesian War. But the Romans really loved the Spartans, and if there's anybody that influenced a lot of this kind of militarism, which is the backbone of, Roman culture that we can see expressed through this veneration of the god Mars, that really connected them very much to Spartan culture. Now, the Roman tradition that kind of came out of this, Romans people throughout that Italian peninsula, there are really a lot of different people. Something about Italy that should be understood now and always. And whenever we return to Rome, whenever we return to Italy, this is going to be true, is that Italy is very much regionally composed. Much like Greece, they're on a peninsula. Much like Greece, they're intersected by a major mountain range that makes the north very different from the south, the east very different than the west. That being the case, there's going to be a lot of kind of individualistic regional identities that are all going to bring their own thing into the Roman mix and influence that Roman culture, most especially farming practices, because Rome for a very long time is a farming culture, and they're one of the biggest agricultural producers for a very long time, most especially because of the way they tend to control trade around Sicily and around the south of Italy, where we have some very substantial farmlands. We always talk about Sicily being the breadbasket of the Mediterranean. This is most especially true here. Now let's talk about some of the themes and the tensions that we're going to see emerging in this chapter that kind of come out of that cultural suffusion. Really, the thing that makes Rome great at first is that agriculture that we are just talking about and the trade that the Etruscans brought, right? Luxury items for the Greeks, especially. The Greeks love to buy the clothes of the Etruscans for their cool parties, all those symposia, right? It's always very cool to have that awesome dress that you got all the way from the Po River Valley. You know, things like this were items of bouginess. They were items of the bourgeoisie, the elite class, the upper middle class, right? And we also see that the Persians really loved Etruscan design because it was so colorful, something that the Persians themselves incorporated quite a lot into their own clothing styles. But they're really very agricultural, and it's going to continue to be this way until we start entering the Gracchan reforms and we start seeing the land-based economy, this agricultural-based economy, starts switching over to a money-based economy. Until that tension arises, we're going to see a largely agricultural culture. We're going to see a lot of that multiculturalism we just talked about. Roman people themselves are really a mixture of multiple traditions and cultures, and their location on the Mediterranean makes them ideally placed to have lots of multicultural interactions. And then when we get into empire, when we start getting to the end of this chapter and Rome really starts to expand, we'll see that they come in contact with even more Mediterranean cultures through citizenship. And really, it's about that citizenship, that sense of belonging, that a lot of multicultural interactions took place. Because citizenship could be granted, in theory, to just about anyone who earned that place. Because military service was not mandatory for just everybody. It was mandatory, though, for all citizens. All citizens were expected to, in some way, shape, or form, contribute to the military. Although, as we'll see towards the later part of the Republic, many people would pay their way out of that. They'd send a slave in their place, which caused a few bits of tension here and there, and especially with generals like Julius Caesar, who would often wage the common complaint against patricians that they were weak because they ceased to perform their military service to the state. Because really, military service, conquest, and militarism is a huge part of Roman culture. It absolutely is. Militarism is the way that you show your social status. It's the way that you make a political position. We'll see this with the Office of Ladders, that to climb that, you must in some way, shape, or form perform military service. But this idea of militarism was just ingrained in cultural concepts in general. And that really kind of got at a Roman idea that there was a divine destiny for Rome, that Rome was meant to spread itself far and wide because that's what the god Mars had gifted them with through this conquest of Romulus and Remus, right? And we're going to see that become more and more a feature as the chapter goes on, but we're going to see it also create a number of tensions with the Republican system. Because the Republican system and this idea of citizenship was also very much part and parcel of how Romans saw themselves. They saw themselves as people who took part in their government, who cared about their government, much the same way that the Greeks did. Public spaces were places where people met to have political conversations. But it should be noted that Romans did not have quite so many traditions of kind of open airing of conflict that we saw in parts of the Greek world, and we certainly saw in the early Macedonian kingdom, right? That, hey, let's all meet in a hall and you can air your grievances. That's not necessarily, you have to have a certain grain of salt and a certain air of modicum, but we'll see the way that people negotiated that with social manners, because this idea of traditional Roman values was really attached to how appropriate Romans should behave and deport themselves in order to demonstrate their social status. Because if you had rough manners, if you weren't representing physically and in your speech and in the manner that you lived, in the way that you set up your household, ran your family, etc., in accordance with these traditional Roman values, then it was really, you weren't considered to be high class, you were low class at that point. But the way that these traditional Roman values and the way that politics were enacted was through a really dedicated patron-client system. You know, at this time, to climb the ladder of offices, you really had to have a patron, somebody who was superior to you in status and wealth, who had a good name. If you were a poor citizen who wanted to make your way into politics, then you did so. Or if you wanted to even just set social status, perhaps you couldn't have a real political career, but you could attach yourself as a member of the kind of entourage of a wealthy and successful politician, and he would show you the ropes, as it were, and that was expected. And there was obligations that went both ways. There's obligations that the patron held to the client and the client held to the patron. And in fact, when we see a lot of tensions and breakdown of the Roman system, we're going to see it in terms of how that patron-client system did or did not function for obligations being carried through. So if the patrons failed to serve their obligation to their clients, those clients could become dangerous enemies. And we saw this in the case of Julius Caesar, who was very busy trying to keep the military happy and keep the poor happy. Both of these endeavors were smart choices, but he didn't keep enough of his clients happy, those men who were part of his entourage. And some of those men were the same men who stabbed him on the steps of the Great Forum and took his life. So we'll see some tensions in this system, but we'll see that this system is the way that politics are enacted on an everyday basis in a republican democracy, because it is a partial democracy. It's not the radical democracy we saw in Athens, but it certainly is a democracy. And this republican system is highly valued by the Romans. And even when we enter into the age of empire, and much of this republic is really gone and is replaced by a facade, really, a kind of fake front of republicanism that really hides an imperial dictatorship. People still need the facade, they still need the idea of republicanism because it's so central to Roman identity. And Roman identity really revolves around this notion of values and traditions, the mos maiorum. And what does this mean? Let's look this up in our books and see what this means, right? If we flip through, it's a good idea, guys, when you're in your textbook, to really concentrate on those terms that your textbook gives a definition for. It's really, really important to get in that habit, because these terms tend to be incredibly, incredibly important to the major idea, the topic, the thesis of each chapter. So it's good to get in the habit of picking those out of your textbook. And so by now, hopefully, you've come upon mos maiorum and you're going, oh, that means way of the elders. And what that really means is that old is tested. It's true because it's been tested. It's been done by smarter people than ourselves, and this is part of a respect for the ancestors and the great family names that Roman people really buttressed as the top of their social hierarchy, those old family names, the top families that have been ruling since time memorial, right? Now, some of these weren't so terribly old. Some of them weren't so terribly tested. However, if you really wanted people to get behind an idea, you would try to at least make them think that it was something old. It was some old value. When we get to Octavian Augustus, we'll see that that's one of the ways he was able to take away so much of the Republican system without incensing people, is that he said that he was instituting old, traditional, tested Roman values. New, on the other hand, new ideas, new concepts, new innovations in government, in thought, in philosophy were considered dangerous. This is one of the reasons we see them mass reproducing sculptures from the Athenian Golden Age, because these were old sculptures that had been around in Roman culture for some time. And this kind of gets that, the virtues that people believed must be possessed if you were to have social status. Because the idea here was that there was eternal moral values that connected Romans to one another. And they had to honor the gods because the gods gave them divine support, but they had to honor these traditions, which were themselves given to them by the gods. Because this idea here was that justice didn't come from the gods. Gods didn't dole out justice, no. And justice really didn't come from a system of social hierarchy. Social hierarchy, they believed, was natural. It was born in, which makes sense when the top of your social hierarchy are a series of landed names. That would be our patricians, right? Patricians here being the big one. These were the old landed family names. They were the top of the top, the cream of the crust. And the idea was they were rich because they were born that way naturally, because they had divine justice already in them, which is why they were born into that name, because they already possessed it. The idea was, though, that you showed certain behaviors that lined up with mos maiorum in order to demonstrate your value to your culture and to give back to your culture, because civic duties in the Roman world were considered part of your citizenship obligations. Whether you were poor or you were rich, it was considered your duty to engage civically and to demonstrate these basic Roman values. And they were very much gendered. For the men, the idea here was this kind of manly virtue, virtus, right? That's even a masculine noun. And what men were meant to show was courage and strength, loyalty to the state and to his fellow people, and most especially to his family. He was supposed to show wisdom, right? So you had to weigh things out carefully, again, against that mos maiorum, against the old and the tested. Does this make sense with our old tested values? And you had to have a certain amount of moral purity, not because of justice. Again, this is not something the gods expected. They did not expect moral purity. It's just that you showed moral purity as a way to demonstrate your mos maiorum and thus demonstrate your social status. Now, what men were expected to do with this is to enact it in the public world of Rome through elections to offices, through military posts, and through military duty. Military duty being in big, bold letters, underlined, 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 right? Because this is huge. It's very, very, very important. But all of that outward expression, that public expression of mos maiorum, was meant to reflect your very private mos maiorum, that you fulfill your duties to your family, to your father, right? This is incredibly important. Fathers are very, very important, and we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to Patria Potestas, or paterfamilia, as it's actually more often used. It should be noted that patria potestas is actually a phrase that we got in the Middle Ages, and it wasn't in popular use at this time in Rome. They would have used paterfamilia at that time, that and familias, which was more common at that time. Now, women were also expected to show mos maiorum, though they didn't have to do so through military duty. They didn't have to do so through elections and posts. And in fact, women were not involved in politics or in the military at all, really, outside of in a support role as wives and mothers. However, wives and mothers is kind of the name of the game. The way that you showed your best values to just have a buttload of children, lots and lots of children. That was the ultimate expectation. And we'll see that the more expansionism becomes a feature of Roman life, the more this is going to be true. But you are also meant to manage your household, and we'll see some of the reasons why that's important, because Roman women had different kinds of rights and laws for them than what we saw in Athens, but it would be very similar to what we saw in Macedonia, right? When we were talking about Alexander the Great and the way that Philip II and Alexander the Great brought a very different system of ownership and contract and legal inheritance into the Greek world than what we saw before. But women here did have certain rights, and as such, they were very much household managers, and that should be familiar to us from our Xenophon text for our primary source analysis, right? Household management is very important to the Romans, just as it was to the Greeks. But they were meant to provide moral education for their children. They're meant to show their children how they could best be the best Roman citizens possible, to show that mos maiorum. They're supposed to be wise, right? They had to be wise in the way they educated, but they were really the moral compass of any given family. So really, we saw women reflecting what they would call sophias, wisdom. Wisdom is usually the word that we see attached to women at this time. Sophias, from the Greek, where we get philosophy, right, comes from sophias, which is wisdom. Now, all citizens, be they female or men, and especially people in the client-patron system, were also meant to show certain mos maiorum values, the big one being fidelis, faithfulness, right? You kept your obligations. This kind of Game of Thrones idea. Lannister always pays his debt. This could definitely be a Roman value system, and much of the time when I think of Game of Thrones, I think that it's meant to symbolically capture a lot of the tete-a-tete between various empires in the Western world. And if that is so, I would say the Lannisters absolutely kind of are a hodgepodge of the Romans and the early Anglo-Saxons. Now, debt is of course going to be a constant source of tension in the Roman world, just as it was in the Greek world. And it's often going to be that linchpin, right, in major changeovers and transformations from one period of Rome to the other, especially when we go from the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. Something to keep in mind for that secondary source analysis assignment coming up. So really, rich people were meant to patron somebody. If you didn't patron somebody as a rich person, then you have not fulfilled your mos maiorum obligation. But you're also meant to patron people in general. The more money you had, the more you were expected to contribute to society, to religious festivals, to the creation of public works, to the creation of those famous Roman roads, the vias, right? Or via, because there is no actual hard V sound in Latin, so it would be considered via. And when you hear the term via, What that means is through, because that comes from the word for road. So you built roads, you built temples to Mars, you built a aqueduct for your city if you had money. This was expected. It was expected that you would contribute to the religious and the civic life the more money you had. And even if you didn't have money, if you were lower class, the idea was you supported that by attaching yourself to a wealthy patron as a client. So you supported that patron and supported their good works, and therefore were part of that civic engagement. But probably more than anything, and of course, it's all about that military. Now, certain folks that didn't have any citizenship weren't expected to contribute too much to the military, nor were they expected to receive a military education. But if you wanted to go up in the ladder of offices, you had to do so. So political and military engagement were a big part of that fidelis, the way you showed your faith to your nation. But so too was, this religion, right? And we have different places where religion is enacted. You're going to see me talk about this a lot, guys. The public versus the private space, right? So we have public enactments of religion, and then we have private enactments of religion. I'm going to talk about the public and the private space with a lot of things. We talked about the public versus the private space for women, right? How women were expected to perform in the Greek world in public, and how they were expected to behave and what they were expected to do in private. Very different expectations, very different roles and rules. The same can be said of religion and virtue. Though we see a certain mirrored reflection, I'm going to add an S there because that's at this time the S was still there. It's going to get dropped towards the late part of the empire when we see the influence of some other Indo-European, Mediterranean languages. But anyway, sorry, I get geeky about language sometimes. Now, one thing though that should be noted about the distance between the private and the public in the Roman world is that there wasn't a whole heck of a lot of distance between the private and the public world, and that what you did in public was supposed to reflect what you did in private. What you did in private was a reflection of your larger duty to your nation, right? So we see this best expressed through this idea of the patria potestas, or really paterfamilias, this idea of the father's power, right? Just as people who ran in the Senate were like fathers to the nation, they were wise elder advisors to the nation. You should be that same thing when you are there with your family. You should have those same skills. You should have that same wisdom. You should show that same virtus, right? The family was meant to mirror the state. The state was meant to mirror the family. And what that meant, that the father had control over his children, his slaves, his patrons. That control had to be enforced and enacted on a daily basis. Now, it should be known that there were certain limits to how much this could be expressed, and we'll talk a little bit about this when we talk about women and women's ownership and property rights here in a moment. One thing that we can note is that the power of the father was so great that he even had the power of life and death, because one very popular practice in the Roman world was exposure of female infants to the weather. So if you had a female child, that was not considered to be advantageous. She couldn't go into politics. Too many female children, too, could be a drain on your resources, and we'll talk about why here in a moment. So it was the father's duty to take that child, carry them off, and leave them on a rock somewhere in the wilderness and let nature do its course. The idea, they had a great story about this where the goddess Hera, or the goddess Persephone, comes and takes the child away to Hades with her because she's lonely down there during parts of the year, which was a really sweet way of explaining away why they were killing so many female children off. But that power was absolute. It really was absolute. And they were meant to be guardians and mentors and leaders of their family and of the state. And we see this reflected, right, in this. Look at this statue. We have the large figure of the father that is central, and he holds in each hand what looks like two kind of floating detached heads. It almost looks like he's decapitated his children, is holding their serenely smiling faces in his hand. No, the idea here being that they are smaller and they are under his power, right? So we see that reflected even in sculptures, because these kinds of sculptures, these busts that would have the father with the two children with sometimes his wife, the wife and the two children were always smaller than the father, just to indicate that power structure. Because this social hierarchy was considered natural. It was born to us, and it was the root of justice. To turn against this was to bring injustice not just upon your family. You could potentially destroy your family, but the idea was you could potentially destroy the entire state, which ran on the divine protection of the gods. And the gods required that you fulfill these virtues to continue to protect them. So it also displayed status and social symbols and social hierarchy here in the Roman world. Now, the women of the Republic had in some ways more rights than what we saw in the Greek world. In some ways, less rights. One thing is that the father never stops being the guardian to his child. Really, even once she marries, the person who is her real primary ruler is the father. That's even expressed in terms of ownership laws, because female property, women can own a certain degree of property, but that property is really run and at the end of the day still owned by the father even after marriage. Until the father dies, a female child can at any time have any of her possessions redacted by her father. The idea there was that would keep women from what they were wont to do, because in the Roman world there was a certain belief that women were a little bit silly in the head at times, and that silliness needed to be girded by the wisdom of the man, because women may have moral purity, but they didn't always have logical purity. So the father had to keep them in line and continue to keep them from veering off the path of virtue, the mos maiorum. But because of that father centrality in law, that meant that women had certain marriage rights that you don't see expressed in the Greek world, right? A wife was not controlled by her husband, right? She was meant to do certain duties, but she was not controlled by him. He was her guardian, especially when it came to conducting business. He could be her guardian, but this was largely a formality. Women could own property, they could run businesses, and prenuptial agreements were very common. Divorce was incredibly legally simple for women, and this was kind of a reflection of an idea that we'll get to here in a moment when we discuss Roman law with the 12 tables, the idea that law must be simple so it can be easily enacted by citizens. But one thing that should be noted is if there were a divorce men would get the children, not women. Not like in our culture where we have really kind of more of a preponderance towards women gaining custody of children in courts. Men would gain the custody of courts here. But women were allowed to go into the public, and in fact, it was a very popular thing for them to do. We'll see a lot of women out there in the public world. We'll see women who go to political events to watch them because they are entertained by them. They'll go to the circus to watch a gladiatorial competition. They'll go to the marketplace. The richer the woman, the more it was considered that you'd have some kind of quote-unquote protection with you. Somebody who could fight off a potential attacker, sure, but it was not considered something that they needed. So there's a little bit more social freedom, a little bit more legal freedom, but still certain gendered expectations. Women, much like in the Greek world, were very, very vocal at dinner parties. They were a constant voice of critique. Probably one of the most infamous of these would be the wife of Octavian Augustus, who is known to be an intensely smart woman with an acid tongue, who is very good at dressing down some of Octavian's worst enemies. So they had a lot of behind the scene powers, as well as a little bit more social freedom. Now, when we left off in the Hellenistic era, we started to see some kind of emotional expression. We started to see some features that we didn't see in the Greek Golden Age, right? We started to see aged old people, which we never saw in the Hellenic world. Well, this is definitely not the case with Rome. We see here the bust of a wealthy patrician, right? Who has lots and lots and lots of lines on his face. The idea here being that age equals wisdom. It was expected that men on their busts would have a bald pate and lots of lines to show that they had made it to an advanced age and thus were demonstrating their mos maiorum, their wisdom, the fact that they had earned all of those lines through hard work and dedication. Now, it might be noticed that the same cannot be said of women, because this is actually the wife of this guy right here. And when these statues were made, they were only about, I think, 5-6 years apart. So you can see that women really still have that ideal of beauty, because beauty has to do with that idea of moral purity, right? Moral purity and youth go hand in hand, right? We still tend to see that innocence and purity is associated with youth, so women still tended to be a little bit more idealistic, although we'll see at times of tension, there will be more women who are shown in art with lines, and we'll see more motive expressions like we saw in the Hellenistic world. And in fact, some of that may also be an expression of the influence of those changes of the Hellenistic world on Greek art that was so valued and highly sought after in the Roman world. Now, when it came to public and private enactments of religion, we still see a lot of that same theme that we saw in the public and the private life in other parts of Rome, right? We're going to see that the private is meant to reflect the public, just as the public is meant to reflect the private. We're going to see that kind of back and forth relationship, true. But we're going to see a little bit more of a space made between the public and the private when it came to religion and the enactment of religion, especially in everyday life. And of course, as we noted, the Greek religion is really just kind of a redux, right? A kind of reboot of the Greek pantheon, with certain things emphasized over what the Greeks did. Of course, Mars being the most central of these, Mars being the god of war, because he was tied directly to the Romulus and Remus story of Rome's creation. Now, the way that people expressed their citizenship and their duty to the state was through that civic engagement, right? And one great way as a patron that you could express your civic engagement was to, in some way, shape, or form, throw a religious festival. So you go and get lots and lots of sow heads, right? Cows were still very popular as religious symbols. And in fact, the cult of Mithras, which we saw in Mycenaean Greece, and with that bull deification, right? Like the worship of the bull, the sacred bull. This was tied to a cult of Mithras that came around the bull. Bulls were very much a central part of religious festivals in Rome, just the same way they were in Greece, the same way they were in really much of the Mediterranean world. Bulls were a very significant feature in religious festivals. They were often slaughtered, and in the slaughtering, meat was provided to people, and it's some of the only meat they would eat all year, just like with the Greeks. Having that protein in your diet was something that a good patron would give you by throwing a big religious festival. So that's a way that you would in public show and express your devotion to the gods, to continue to secure their protection, not just of you and your family, but of all of the Roman Republic. And officials were expected to provide this. If you didn't, you wouldn't stay an official for very long. You'd be voted out pretty quickly. So this could be very expensive. And when we start to see crisis during the later part of the Republic, when we start to move from a land-based to a money-based economy, and the patrician class starts being more money poor, it's going to be difficult for them to keep up with these religious obligations. And in fact, it's going to lead to some serious spiraling debt. But one thing that we also saw, and we still will see in lots of the Western world, especially in the Middle Ages, this continued to be a very popular process, was the anthropomorphization of certain Roman values, of certain traditional values. So if you were talking about, for example, the pietas, right? This idea of devotion and duty, the way that you would demonstrate that to your family, to the state, to your friends, to your patrons, your clients, to the gods, that these were represented by women. Almost all of the time, women were the anthropomorphic expression of values, right? Except for in the case, of course, of the god Mars and the idea of the manly virtue of military strength and courage, right? So you'll see this actually quite a lot. So if you see in a lot of primary sources, when you see the representation of some woman who says, and underneath it it'll say Sophias, that would be wisdom. That woman is meant to represent wisdom. We still actually follow this practice in many ways. For example, when you go into a courtroom, what do you see? You see the statue of Justice. Justice is a blind woman holding a set of scales, right? This is from that Roman tradition of representing values like justice in a human form, usually a female form, and that represents that female notion of purity, of moral purity. Women were meant to be the moral vessels of the gods, and they were meant to educate people on how to be more moral. So we see that through the pietas, especially devotion and duty, right? Now, in private, we had sometimes a little bit more odd tradition here and there. We would have ancestor worship. This likely came from the Etruscans and Etruscan culture from that early Roman period of the 7 kings before the Senate and the Assembly really wrested control and established the Republic way back in the early 700s to 600s. And this ancestor worship, would include having pictures of some of your best and most successful patrician ancestors. Especially patricians would have these household shrines. They weren't quite as common for poor people who weren't really too much into worshiping their ancestors as much as the patricians were, but patricians definitely were. You would have a good bust of most every powerful member of your family somewhere in your house, perhaps near your family shrine, because indoor shrines were very popular. As we noted, uh, in the Greek world, this is also true in the Roman world. Temples were not there the way churches are for people now. People didn't go to a temple and sit down and worship and listen to somebody speak to them some story of the gods or something along those lines. No. People went to temples to offer up uh, objects to the gods and shuffle right the heck on out. And you can see that even in the floor plan, because the idea was temples were where the gods lived here on the earth, because the gods walked the earth. And they would stop and visit your temple if it was nice enough, and in visiting your temple would grant their protection and divine presence and divine destiny, right, to your great city. So you wanted to get the gods to try to come and live in your temple by having the coolest temple with the coolest stuff. But it wasn't a place where people gathered to worship. Where people would do their worshiping was at their indoor shrines. And those shrines could be to a number of the polytheistic gods, Mars, of course, being a big feature here. But you would also have other things that, other gods that you would pray to for different purposes. There's lots of different purposes that the gods could serve. So, perhaps you wanted to ask for better fertility. You would pray to, Artemis, the goddess of the hunt, or Athena, as she was called by the Romans. You would pray to her to ask her for her divine favor. She was, because the goddess of the hunt was also the goddess of fertility, which makes quite a bit of sense when you see the story itself. But one thing that also happened at these indoor shrines was that use of some of the things we were talking about earlier, auguries and auspices. So cutting up animals and looking at their guts and seeing what kind of things would happen in your future and make good predictions for your future. People also very much took omens seriously. Certain things were considered bad omens, certain things were considered good omens. People would pay attention to these, and they would go to their indoor shrines to meditate upon them to try to determine what their future would be, because the fates were still, like they were with the Greeks, an important part of people's religious and philosophical understanding. And a lot of it had to do with the role of the gods. They were there as protectors. So many rituals revolved around this notion of protection. But as we get later into the empire, we'll see that the imperial cult will replace these kinds of a lot of these private and public shrines with shrines dedicated to the notion of the state and the gifts that the state provides. And we'll see some of the tensions that that reflects in society. So let's talk a little bit about the power and the politics of this era. So we began with a monarchy in the early part of the Rome's rise, from 753 to about 509, although really in the 600s was when we started to see some serious competition for power. We saw, the 7 kings at the very beginning who had advisors, and that's where we got the Senate and the assemblies from. The Senate and the assemblies began as advisors to the king. They're people who were wise and wizened, usually elder people, the ways of the elder, mos maiorum being again a reflection here. And they would advise the king. Over time, they wrested more and more power from that monarchy. But it's from this time period that we get the division of society into 2 basic orders. The patricians, those named families, that's the aristocracy. They're the landed class. They're the people who own land. They're the people who run for office. They're the ones paying for those religious festivals. They're the ones who are providing public works for their towns and their cities. These are the patricians. And then we have the plebeians, which is pretty much everybody else. It doesn't matter how poor or how rich you are. If you're not from a named family, you're a plebeian. And we're going to see some of the tensions that creates, especially when we get into the Gracken reforms and when we start to see that land-based economy switch over to a money-based economy. But the way that the patricians and the plebeians were meant to enact this is that there would be no intermarriage between the two. That was the basic law, the idea being to keep the patrician line pure, which is why we see so much incest sometimes in the Roman world in patrician families, especially when we enter into the age of empire, where the idea of the blood purity of patricians was even more highly respected because it reflected tensions between patricians and plebeians at the time. But this no intermarriage meant that there was very little in the way of what you can do in terms of social mobility. So anybody can be a citizen, right? Anybody can be a citizen. God damn it. It's like they know that I'm recording. It's never this noisy when I come out to smoke. Ridiculous. Okay. All right, so although there was no intermarriage in between the two orders, we're going to see sometimes that's going to break down a little bit here and there, especially at times of tension. And the idea too being that you're supposed to have lots of babies. But what happens when, because you're rich and you have better access to aqueducts that are made with lead in the mortar, or perhaps because you took on the Greek tradition of leading your wine, which was very popular, or because you were rich and you drank out of pewter cups instead of wooden cups, right, or clay cups, you would have a greater exposure to lead. Perhaps you couldn't have many children, and this in fact was a common thing that happened in Rome, especially the more that the Roman Republic dragged on, the more we saw lower birth rates in the elite. But in general, statistically speaking, people who have more money, by and large, on average, have fewer children. It's hard to say why that is. It's just kind of a fact of life. But perhaps because you weren't able to have as many children and you didn't want to appear as not possessing those Roman values, one thing that people could do was adopt from the plebeian caste. So perhaps as a patron, one of your clients was incredibly gifted in the art of military tactics or in oratory skills, etc. You would say, hey, I should go ahead and adopt them. That's actually how Octavian Augustus became a patrician himself, as he was adopted at a very, very young age by Julius Caesar's family, indeed, who was his uncle, who took him on as a patron and got him adopted into a wealthy patrician family, which allowed him to climb through the offices and eventually become Caesar. So there were ways to kind of gird this system, but by and large, these orders were separate and they were meant to stay separate. But a lot of the tensions that we see rise, especially in the late Republic, come from the tension between these two classes and the way that breaking down society into these two classes could be problematic. But one thing that wasn't terribly problematic was the law systems, which were made particularly simple, as we saw with the 12 tables. The 12 tables, which were established from 451 to 449 BCE, were a series of simply worded laws, and the big thing that these really pushed forward was that check and balance system that was such a big part of the Roman law system. And we see this expressed most specifically with the collegiate system. The idea that most posts had two people on it, so they would check each other's power, so no one person would become too powerful. So even the most powerful person in the Roman ladder of offices, the consuls, there's always two consuls, the idea being that they could check each other's powers. This system of checks and balances and the simply worded laws were the way that people enacted that civic duty, the way that they showed their virtue, the way that they showed their mos maiorum. Now, these 12 tables were so important to Roman life that children were required to memorize them at a very young age. They were put up all over the Roman world in public spaces so people could have easy access to them, especially for foreigners and people who were trading in Roman cities. The idea being you need to know these laws because we're going to hold you to them. And in fact, the court systems were where much of Roman law saw its expression. Now, if you were an aristocrat, it was expected that you would enter into mandatory military service. Now, to rise through the ladder of offices, which we'll talk about here in a second, you were required to serve so many years for each step up the ladder. You had to give this many more years of military service in order to climb that much higher in the ladder. So it didn't matter if you could give a really great speech the way it could be in Athens, where you never have to pick up a sword to be a powerful man. That is not true here in the Roman world, though we'll see that when the Republic starts to crumble, one popular thing that rich patricians will do is send a slave in their stead to serve the military service and then take the paperwork. And this practice was so popular at the time that it was one of the ways that Caesar was able to make fun of some of his worst enemies, even one of the enemies in the first triumvirate that he managed to have assassinated. One of the common complaints he waged against them was that they had soft hands. The implication there being that or sometimes he would say they had the hands of slave senders. The implication there being that they never did their military service, but instead had somebody else do it for them, and that made them less Roman. Now, if you became very powerful as a general, you would be forced to relocate out of your city or town of your origin. The idea there being you might have too much of a family-based, clan-based power system there that could have the potential to overthrow the government. And this was such a cause for concern that it was expected that you would be moved from one province to another, especially if you started to establish too much power. Now again, when we start to see at the end of the Republic some breakdown of the Republican system, this is one of the places where we'll see that breakdown, that we'll see clans allowing generals to stay next to their family member, their clan, their family, right? A clan would be the expansion of the family, friends, supporters, which included a lot of these clients, right? So all those clients that you would get if you were doing well, those clients would be a part of your clan. And when we start to see a breakdown in the Republic, we'll see that one of the things that allows social disorder, civil war, and assassination is that people are not moved away from their clan, their power base. Now, the monarchs really, the more the Republic draws on after the time of the Seven Kings, especially after 509, when we get into really the establishment of the Republic in 509 after a pretty protracted civil war, we're going to see the monarchs become a little bit more than puppets. Really, the people who own much of the power are the Senate. The Senate is the big powerhouse, and especially the consuls. These are really the folks that own the most power in the Republic. And we're also going to see after 509 more of an idea that we need to expand. We need to expand outward, and it begins with Rome because they go out of that tiny little dot in the Po Valley to take over all of really the Italian peninsula, save a very, very few small swaths here and there that held out against expansion. And a lot of that expansion happened first through the Navy, a Navy that at first had been a part and parcel of trade economy, but over time began to be attached to the military body. And we're also going to see the creation of massive armies, but it should be noted that it's not until we get into the empire that we see a standing army attached to the city, or most especially any leader who can get that army, because really what we have is client armies, right? Client armies. So they'd be armies that were ruled by a trusted general that would receive orders from the Senate, and then the general would receive also gifts from the Senate, and the general was meant to distribute these gifts to his soldiers to keep their loyalty, right? Again, it's that patron-client system that we see expressed even in the way that the military is run. And we're going to see that when that changes over, it's when the military starts to seize control, because these client armies can't really be controlled by the Senate all the time. They end up being controlled by their general, because it's their general who determines their welfare, their fate. If the general doesn't give you money, it's the general's fault, but the general could sometimes do a really good middle management position. I'd love to give you all these rewards and benefits, guys, but the Senate just isn't giving me money. Hey, let's go march on Rome. That's what Julius Caesar did, and it was terribly, terribly effective. And when we see times of tension, when we start to see a breakdown of the client patron system based on the changeover to a money-based economy, which really deprives the Senate of a lot of its monetary power and puts monetary power into the hands of more and more plebeians. We're going to see generals not able to pay off their soldiers. We're going to see spiraling debt of generals and of soldiers, generals who are expected to continue to be patrons to their society as well as to their soldiers, can't keep up with it anymore. And that breakdown is really going to lead us into the empire. But the res publica, which would be that early republic established in 509, saw laws as enforcers of that mos maiorum. It was all an extension of that cultural tradition, a tradition tied into law and into order. Now here's that ladder of offices we were talking about, right? This is the big powerhouse. We have the Senate that's made up of 300 basic members. And I'll let you guys kind of read this over. I'm not going to go into great detail on each and every one of these, but something that I'd like to say here is that this is really important for your SSA. I can't emphasize this enough. The ladder of offices is the way that you understand the political systems that Paul A. Bishop is talking about in the article that you're going to use to compare and contrast the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire. And really the big difference between the Roman Republic, and one of the big differences between the Roman Republic and the Roman Empire, is the way this ladder of offices changed. At this time, it's really much more considered kind of a meritocracy, right? Where you do more things, you're more successful, and you rise through the ranks. But you can see here that a lot of this has to do with military leadership, because one thing that we should note here is that in order to become a Senate member or a consul, it's required that you have at least 10 years of military service. Yeah, that's a lot, especially when you consider the common lifespan of people at this time. It's not too terrible, but it's not what we know now. So 10 years could be a really, really long time, but it was considered necessary that you in some way, shape, or form serve the military. Now, some of these positions don't require as much in the way of military service. The quaestor, for example, doesn't require military service, right? The the aedile. These are the people who would kind of maintain public works. So they were the ones who were building the great colosseums, or the ones who would oversee their upkeep, make sure that bread was put out, because bread, people received gifts of bread when they went to the Circus Maximus or some public event. Bread would be given out for free as part of the gift, that patron-client gift to the people. This would be overseen by the aediles. They would not need to serve in the military, nor would the quaestors. The idea here being those guys are kind of more the bureaucrat. But if you had any official job, the consul, the praetor, the dictator later, but this is going to be post Caesar. So once we get the Caesars, right, that's when we start seeing that dictator. But at any time from the very establishment of the Republic, at any time, the Senate could decide that at a time of an emergency, a temporary dictator could be set into place to make passing laws more efficient. It's kind of like here in America, when we have a state of emergency, we can enact certain laws that violate the basic codes of the Constitution, right? The idea here still being that it's meant to be temporary, and we'll see that one of the things that transitions us into the empire is that this temporary position starts to become a full-time position, a constant position, and the position of power. But that's going to take some time. Now, the censors did in fact need to perform some sort of military service, because censors oftentimes were people who would later be elected to Senate. And the idea being nobody in Senate should not have some form of military service. And there's certain folks, like anybody who had anything to do with war planning had to have military service. Anybody who had anything to do with trying people in the courts of laws had to have some kind of military service. The plebeians did not. The plebeians could basically, just like any plebeian in society, they didn't have certain obligations to military service. And again, keep in mind for your SSA, the way that that ladder of office changes, and even the way that Augustus Caesar reorders the number of people in the Senate, the number of people in the assemblies. It's to kind of attack that collegiate system where there is checks and balances. He wasn't so much into the idea of checks and balances as he was to getting rid of his enemies by stocking certain parts of the government with more and more of his supporters, and taking out the folks that were his enemies, or at least lessening their ability to stand in his way. Now again, the maintenance of the public space is a big part of the Roman world. And the Romans very much learned from the Persians that idea of the satrap, right? The administrative unit. They are going to use that in the empire, but what they're also going to use is that idea of the road systems and the courier system. And this is really what's going to make the empire run for as long as it does, is knowledge of this system and use of this system. The Roman road was a really big part of Roman identity. It's how people were able to travel in a way in the Roman world that they couldn't in much of the rest of the Mediterranean world outside of those Persian areas where Persians established their own road system. But we can see kind of an idea of the public space from here. The main, this is really Rome right here, the actual city, as opposed to the whole government. So we see some of the public space that we would see, right? We see temples. The Temple of Jupiter is a very, very big temple in the Roman world, as was the Temple of Vesta, the Vestal Virgins. So that would be what the women would worship at, right? That's that purity, right? The pietas. And then we have the men here really for that kind of virtus, that manly virtue. Now when we get into the empire, one of the expressions of the change in values from the republic to the empire is how many of the temples of Jupiter and of Vespa are replaced with temples to Mars, Mars Volta specifically. And this really notes that symbolic expansionism. But at this time we saw a lot of gendered temples. We'll have a temple for men and a temple for women in most every major city. We'll also have some kind of circus for people to go and get bread at, for people to go and get entertained in. They can watch a chariot race. They can watch a group of slaves attack each other to the death. They can watch them attack animals. Animal fights were very, very popular. So was hunting in an arena in front of spectators. This is a popular thing that people would do. So that would be somewhere near the city center so people could go and visit it. We would, of course, have this wall, all of this wall, fortifying walls. Fortifying walls are, of course, going to be a big part of the ancient world. Fortifying walls are pretty necessary in a world with very little in the way of, missiles. It's good to have fortifying walls. Missiles kind of make fortifying walls a thing of the past, really. And when we get to the pre-modern period, the more we have weaponry that subverts the use of walls as fortifying structures, the less we're going to see them featured in city building. But we also have things like the Via Suburba. This would be where the kind of wealthier artisans would live, the doers, the makers. Again, that closest thing to the middle class we are usually going to get in the ancient world. We'll also see things like places where slaves are trained for gladiatorial competition, right? Which would sometimes be very close to the circus. Sometimes, though, it would be outside of the city because so many slaves were housed there. The idea being we don't want slaves inside of the walls of the city in case there's a revolt. And when we see the revolt of Spartacus, we'll see exactly why this is an important practice. And of course, we see those heroes. The hero cults are very popular in the Roman world the same way that they are in the Greek world. And the Romans loved Heracles, who they renamed Hercules. They loved that dude. They loved him so much. He was incredibly popular. And when we see kind of the spread of Hellenistic ideas under Alexander the Great, we'll see how Alexander the Great used that worship of Hercules, right, to spread his message far and wide. We talked about that in chapter 4. But probably the biggest one was public works like aqueducts and sewage systems and plumbing that made city living a much better prospect for everybody. And it also helped very much with agriculture and agricultural production, which we know is the backbone of this culture. Now here we have the Roman Forum. It should be noted though that this does not reflect what we would have seen in the Republic. Rome burned during the civil wars, and one of the things that Octavian Augustus Caesar did when he came in and instituted the empire and began the empire really was that he remade Rome, and he very much remade Rome saying that it was according to Rome's traditions and values, but really promoting newer kind of traditions and values by putting way more emphasis on things like war and the divine destiny of Rome to expand its borders outward into the world. that's going to mean some changes in the public space, and probably the biggest change that we saw in the public space between the Republic and the empire was the erosion of the public forum. The public forum was huge under the Republic. It took up probably about 3 city blocks in the modern era, and this was the place where people gathered to enact everyday acts of politics. You know, this is where people could go and listen to someone give a speech on who you should vote for, right? And you could listen to somebody else say who it is you shouldn't vote for, because one of the things of the patron-client system is that one of the things you would do as a duty to your patron is to go out and give speeches about how awesome your patron was and why people should vote for him. You know, kind of like the volunteer folks that you see for the Democratic or the Republican Party going out and passing out, you know, buttons and and things like that. And really the public forum, that idea of the public space and campaigning, is something that we got from the Republican Roman world. So we really saw this reflected in a public forum. Here it would have just been probably taking up this entire space. And you would have the area where poorer people would go to gather and hear things, and then you would have the inner recesses where politics would happen. It should be noted that not just anybody could walk into the area where laws were being passed. They couldn't walk into the area where court decisions were made just at any time. It's kind of similar to what you see here. I'm not just going to walk into the courtroom downtown just for funsies on a Sunday. No, but I may go and hang out at Acacia Park near to that court building, or at the Pioneer Plaza where somebody might be giving a Civic Day speech or something along those lines. Though we'll see a lot more everyday kind of outdoors politicking and campaigning in the Roman world than we see in our modern America. Now, though the Republic from 509 into about the 4th century, so a good solid 100 years, the Republic was really going strong, almost about 150 years of really strong Republican representation. We start to see cracks in the foundations of this republic, and a lot of them come from places that we've already kind of prepared for, that split between the plebeians and the patricians, most especially because rising debt. Because one thing that started to happen more and more as the republic dragged on is that certain patricians became much richer than they'd had been in the early republic, and gave much less out in the form of public works and in support for the poor. The patron-client system in that way started to very much break down, and what they started to do instead was offer loans. One of the reasons why this happened is because a lot of the economy was starting to shift from economy based on land. We'll see that with the land reforms, but this economy based on land and on agriculture began to give way more and more into a money culture. Now, it should be noted that money isn't something that the Romans did very much. The coinage that they tended to use were coins from the Greek world, most especially that of the Macedonians. When the Macedonians rose to power and Alexander the Great set up the Hellenistic kingdoms, right? Money was one of the ways that they showed their leadership, right? They would, part of the spectacle that we talked about was having that coin with your picture stamped on it. It showed people that you were a ruler, but these also came to be a big part of trade economy. And the more that Romans got into trade economy, the more that plebeians who weren't attached to any good patrician name were able to make themselves a sort of middle class and upper middle class because they were money rich. Well, on the same hand, the patricians started to be more and more money poor and name rich. And it's because of this money system that they were really losing their cachet value. So one way that they kind of established their status and tried to put their status forth was by giving out loans at crazy, crazy high payback rates. So we start to see a lot of very poor people be indebted to the patrician class, and sometimes to those plebeian middle class men who themselves set up a patron-client system. And that's going to cause a lot of serious tension in the poor. We're also going to see that the assemblies, especially the tribal assembly, which was a mix of patricians and plebeians, and the plebeian assembly more than anything else, are really going to try to vie for more and more power, especially the more they start making money and start being important men and start themselves contributing civically to their towns and their cities. The more they're going to expect that to be paid back in better in better power and more status, more symbols for them to kind of demonstrate to others. And we saw this definitely, the first time we really see this kind of break out is the reforms from 500 to 450 BCE. This is when we really first start to see this tension rise up, and the way that they kind of try to get around this tension is by setting up tribunes, which are annually elected plebeian officials that have some basic veto powers. So that's more checks, right? They give them a few more checks. But the problem that we also saw here is that rising slave population that we're talking about. Part of the reason why the slave population was rising so much was because so many of them became slaves as a way to pay off their debts. Debt slavery was the fastest rising profession in Rome there, especially when we hit the 4th century, especially towards the later half of the 4th century, because we're going to go into what we call the 3rd century crisis, which was really a horrible time to be a Roman. Debt was insane, and we'll see some of the reasons for that when we get to the Punic Wars here in a minute, because war was really a big part of it. We're going to see one of the major losses that affected Rome more than anything was their exclusive trade rights in Sicily. Sicily, of course, again being the breadbasket of the Mediterranean world. But we also saw that there was a bit of a cold snap that led to a lot of famines and a lot of crop failures. The more that this happens, the more that people are going to start fleeing more and more into the city. And they weren't just coming into the city because it was a poorer life out there in the countryside. They're coming into the city because the city was cool, even if it was filthy and stinky, because all cities in the ancient world are filthy and stinky. But still, they were cool places to be. You could go and be entertained. You could go to an awesome temple and leave your offerings. You could go check out the oracles and have them read your fates. You could go listen to somebody talk about their favorite politician and decide who you're going to vote for today. Things like that were exciting to people, but unfortunately the city really couldn't handle all of these people, and the cities were starting to become more and more overcrowded, much like what we saw at the end of the Athenian Golden Age, when we start seeing the public forums become basically temporary housing areas. We start to see this in Rome at this time as well, that people started living in places that used to be places where you went to hang out, to buy things, to listen to people talk. Now we start seeing people living there, which is really kind of an expression of the tensions rising at this time. And another big expression of the tensions rising at this time were The slave revolts. Oh goodness, just a moment here. Let me see if I can fix this slide. Okay, let's see. There we go. I can't seem to get rid of my pen mark. My eraser isn't working for some reason on my stylus. I apologize, guys. So we're gonna have a little bit of a red line there. Now, slave revolts, which began, actually the thing that started some of the slave revolts began in Sparta for similar reasons to what we saw in Rome. Too many slaves to too few free people. And in fact, one of the leaders of the biggest slave revolt in Rome at this time was himself from Sparta. So that's not terribly surprising. So these slave revolts came in the 1st century, about the time when slaves started to make up about a third of the population. Just think about this. A third of the population were slaves by this time. And this first rebellion was led by one of the gladiators. This is a reason why it's good to have your slaves training outside of the city and not inside of that Colosseum. However, that's exactly how he was able to successfully lead revolt. He led it from the Colosseum itself. Ha 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 ha. Now, one of the things that made Crassus popular, and when we talk a little bit more about Crassus when we discuss the politics of transition between the Roman Republic to the Roman Empire, one of the things that made Crassus so popular was that he was able to put down this massive slave revolt that just went on for, you can see just how many years significant slave revolts were occurring during this time. I mean, that's a lot of years for there to be a lot of slave revolts off and on throughout the Roman Republic. But he put down probably the most devastating of those, the one led by Spartacus. And he put it down in 71 BCE. And what he did is he lined the entire Appian Way, that big road leading into Rome, right, that we just looked at when we were looking at the Roman cityscape. He lined that entire road with crucifixes, with slaves hanging from them as a way to say this is what happens to enemies of the state. And I myself am a huge Spartacus blood and sand fan. And I would say that there's certain things about the show that are historically accurate, but I would grain of salt that, guys. I would super grain of salt that. Obviously, there's certain things that are there for entertainment value. But some of the ideas that we see enacted there, I mean, one thing that slaves were expected to do at dinner parties was have sex with one another for the entertainment of their hosts, because sexuality in the ancient world, it should be noted, was very different than sexuality now. The pre-modern world, that's when we really see a major change in sexual mores, values, in practices, and we really see that cemented in the Victorian age, and we're still to this day living under many of those ideas. But one thing that sex was a very much kind of social thing that people could talk about. It was popular just like it was in the Greek world to have somewhere where you'd have a party. You'd have some kind of cool painting illustrating, a scene from one of the myths of a god having sex with a nubile young woman, etc., etc. And that would be, part of dinner conversation. But it was considered oft times a little bit funny in that case. Those Greek glasses and vases and plates that showed people having sex were very, very popular with Romans as well, and they especially liked to have them at their parties. And one thing that they did like to do is have entertainment based upon sexual intercourse between various slaves as a form of entertainment. This was, in fact, something that happened in the Roman world. Now, the first century is really when we start to see a lot of the debt kind of spiral out of control, and the poor really become more and more dissatisfied with their lot in life. So one of the first attempts to negotiate this tension came from the Gracchus brothers. What they were really kind of attacking was very high-end corruption, especially in the highest of the high, the patrician class, the equites. These were really the noble families, the oldest families out there. The idea here being that they were taking a lot of money from the Senate and not using it at all for this patron-client system, but instead spending it on really awesome parties for them and just the people they wanted to get on their side, right? So they weren't, trickling this down into the rest of society. But it was also about certain factions that were forming, right? Factions within the plebeian assembly itself, factions between the assemblies, most especially between the populares and the optimates. I'm sorry, this should be optimates, not optimares. And if you want kind of more information about this, there's a great breakdown in your chapter, but there's also some great information in Paul A. Bishop's article that you can lean on. One thing that really became a problem is the more the factions began to fights that could even move into the street, and commonly moved into the street with some very violent and devastating results. And this kind of breakdown of law and order was pretty frightening to a Roman people used to this kind of mos maiorum way of being respectable and together and following the order of society. But it obviously was not happening this way at the time, and we see this reflected in what happened to the Gracchus brothers themselves, because the Gracchus brothers attempted to put through a series of reforms, most especially reforms that aimed at giving more mobility and opportunities to the poor, and to take away some of the power of the rich families, and really more than that, to check it, because really what this was it was a breakdown of that collegiate system, right? The idea being we need checks to make sure that no one person gained too much power and prestige. Now, Tiberius was the first of the Gracchus brothers, so it was Tiberius and Gaius. Tiberius won an election to the tribune in 133 BCE and enacted a series of reforms. His opponents tried to block those by implementing some pretty gosh darned illegal senatorial powers. But he really used the plebeian assembly to his advantage, and through the plebeian assembly tried to redistribute land, because these first series of reforms were really about land. These were land reforms, right? So what they were trying to do was make it so there was more land available for the poor, whilst also checking the powers of the rising equites and optimates. Now, he was Tiberius tried to run for a consecutive term, which was not actually allotted by law, and he angered people so much with that move that he was clubbed to death by a series of men, including his own cousin, and a series of senators with their clients. This is the way that you could get people when you're in the Roman world. You'd have all your clients with you, your entourage, right? You would go and be like, hey, Tiberius, what's going on? How's it hanging? And then they would surround you in a big circle, and then they would club you to death and then run off, although stabbing was much more popular because it was easier and cleaner. I think that clubbing was probably a bit of a symbolic death in this case because he was very well hated, especially by the cream of the crop in society. Now, Gaius, unfortunately, didn't have much more, because really Gaius did farming reforms. So it was still land, but this was really attached more to expanding citizenship, subsidizing certain grain prices, and we'll see why that was necessary here in a minute when we talk about the Punic Wars. But he also wanted to check the equites in court. He wanted to make it more possible to try them for corruption in court so they couldn't continue to live above the law. Again, he's blocked by the Senate after he passes that series of laws in BCE, these reforms. And the assemblies had to arm themselves to try to fend off opposition to this bill. Unfortunately, they were not successful. They corner him in the public forum where he chooses to kill himself rather than be ignobly clubbed to death the way his brother was, not but a year before that. Or actually 4 years before that. So, what happened though after that is that more folks did try to check some of these powers with limited amounts of success. The person who had the most success was really Marius, because what Marius really got that a lot of folks didn't was the power of the army. And really, this is going to be the story of Rome. The men who are able to do something for the poor do it by getting the army on their side. The thing that the equites and the noble families and the aristocracy always fail at, and when they do fail, this is why, is because they don't take the military into account. And this is where those client armies come into play, right? Those powerful client armies, because Gaius Marius, he was an equite, yes, but he was a military leader, and he used popular anger in tandem with military support to pass some reforms that on the surface were meant to make people happier and be about redistribution of wealth, but in all reality weren't really the best for the people. But he was able to do lip service and he was very popular with the people. But what the people that he supported, I should note, were the proletarians. And these were folks that weren't the kind of poor farmers living in the countryside that the Gaius or the Gracchus brothers had supported, but the kind of guys that you would see living in the city all the time. You know, your regular working class Joe, as it were. They had no property, they couldn't afford weapons. So what he did is he said we should get them a little bit more money and we should give them the ability to take part in some way, shape, or form with the military and thus get some of those military rewards so they could have ownership and rights. And of course, in the meantime, that means that he has even more support from an even more expanded soldier class that he could use to force the Senate to agree with him, because if there's anything that's going to force the Senate to agree with him, it's the shadow of a massive proletarian army and a mercenary army loyal only to their general. And really, though he has more success than those that came before him, really not enough changes during these reforms. And that's really going to lead us into the Sullan Civil War from 91 to 78 BCE. And this all really begins with Lucius Cornelius Sulla, who's alive from 138 to 78 BCE. And he was a patrician from a patrician family, but like many patricians at this time, he was actually cash poor, because this is really when we start to see the changeover to the cash economy. People are done talking about land reform and about getting land into the right hands. At this point, it's about getting out of debt and having more cash value. And he's one of many patrician families who are cash strapped. They don't have any money. They just have a name. They can't marry any plebeian people who now have more money than they do. There's more rich people on the plebeian assembly than there is in the Senate. Than there is in the tribunal, than there is in the tribal assembly, than there is in the equites, right? This is a problem for folks, especially in the plebiscite, who are kind of like, we want to come up, at the same time that patricians are saying, we want what those guys have, right? So what this leads to, and really what we see here, is that the big clash that we have at this time is between the values associated with that kind of proletarian that we see with Sulla, or with Marius, clashing with this cash-strapped patrician order that we see with Sulla. And in fact, Marius and Sulla get into it over how exactly Rome should move forward from this debt crisis. They are meant to be sharing power as two powerful consuls. However, when Sulla goes away to visit a dying relative, Marius basically takes over the whole charade. Sulla returns with an army. Marius's army is better. And there's a major sacking of Rome. Athens is also sacked, I might add, and so too is Asia Minor, because why not? Got an army, may as well sack some stuff, burn some stuff down. But what this leads to is an embroiled 2-year civil war. Massive civil war. And we see a lot of people who are kind of accusing each other of being a traitor. You see a lot of people through kind of shoddy law systems taking each other's properties and titles from them and redistributing them, which is just, you can't take a property and a title from a noble family and give it to just any old idiot in the street, which is what Marius attempted to do quite a lot of the time. He also tried to get many people into the military that previously wouldn't have been allowed in the military. And there was a lot of wealthy people that were also fraudulently given money that wasn't owed to them by the state. So there's just kind of a lot of chicanery, corruption, and tomfoolery on both sides. Sulla appoints himself a dictator, instituting those emergency offices, right, that we talked about. At any time under a state of emergency, the office of dictator can be enacted by the Senate. And that's what happens when Sulla takes over. However, this is a pretty temporary situation for Sulla. He uses this to kind of reorganize the government, again, making the optimists the coolest. He's all about his own peeps, so that's who he tries to support. And this all really comes to an end because the fighting is so bloody and protracted. There's so much corruption that these three guys, Crassus, Pompey, and Caesar, are able to use their popularity to take over. We see this especially with Crassus, right? He used the his role in tapping down the slave revolts to get popular support. Pompey was very much an optimate. He was a rich boy. He came from the noble classes, so he represented that big name. And then you had Julius Caesar, right? Who was himself from a powerful family, but had a whole heck of a lot of military success and military background, especially in Carthage and in the Punic Wars. And the Punic Wars were a pretty serious set of wars. And really what these were over were major trade routes and trade locations, especially Carthage, because this is really where a lot of trade routes came through, is in Carthage. Carthage is where most of the grains for all of the Mediterranean world went through first, from Sicily, from south of Italy, from the north of Africa. All of those grains that were harvested there would go through Carthage first, so it's huge. Now, Hannibal, after spending a long time fighting for Carthage, wasn't really given his due. This was part of that kind of breakdown between the upper class and the military. And so he took his client army and he marched them right into Rome and sacked Rome in the process. And this was devastating for people. Nobody in Rome thought such a thing would happen. Such an insane notion for people in Rome, for an army to come and sack. And really, this is the thing that kind of led to Hannibal's downfall, is the fact that there's a lot of things the people of Rome would put up with, but burning our city to the ground is certainly not one of them. However, though he wasn't able to be successful in taking over in Rome, he was able to go and leave after this and have a pretty good life thereafter. Yeah, despite this is a great story, and if anybody wants to do a paper on military history, I would say Hannibal is a fascinating figure. I mean, he captured so many people in Rome, including a number of people from noble families, and then sold them as slaves, which is about as bad as you could get there. Now, as said, the thing that kind of brought an end to a lot of this chicanery, this fighting, because the Punic Wars were really over Sicily and Carthage. They were over trade. They were over the breadbasket. When that became interrupted, it was one of the reasons so many people were okay with supporting people like the generals and the powerhouse of the First Triumvirate, because they didn't have food in their belly anymore, because there was a disruption in the bread flow into Rome, and that was a big staple of the Roman diet, so you really can't put a price on how important that was. Now, the First Triumvirate was formed between Julius Caesar, who was a nephew of that great general Marius, right? Then we had Crassus, that governor of Syria, right, like, who put down that slave revolt. We had Pompey, who was a pretty serious rich boy. He was one of those soft-handed people that Julius Caesar liked to make fun of. And in fact, the First Triumvirate, though it was set up to try to end the Sulan Civil War, quickly became infighting between these three powerful people. Julius Caesar was a very, very successful general and continued to conquer, which is how he continued to really kind of win, was by continuing to conquer and garnering popular support. He was very, very popular with the people, really because he wanted to pass a series of laws. In all reality, those laws were meant to make his soldiers happy, right? But he also did a lot of public works, and he proposed some moderate debt cancellations. However, when he really is able to outmaneuver his enemies, the thing that becomes his downfall more than anything else is that he puts a cap on bread subsidization. So this is those gifts that the government gives out to people of bread that keeps them fed. He caps that, and that is one of his most unpopular decisions because this is going to lead to a lot of people starving in the streets, and this is really how he's going to lose a lot of his popular support. But he does expand citizenship rights, and that's going to have some interesting consequences as we move into empire, because those new citizens are going to become part of the new empire with the new rules when we get to Octavian Augustus. But really what he does more than anything else, because he's still very popular with the people, and he's going to be popular with the people long, long after his death, because of the fact that he started that job program, because of the fact that he planned so many public works meant to alleviate some of the issues of these overcrowded cities, because he was trying to rebuild the sacked visage of Rome, because he was canceling debt. He maintained popularity amongst the people for a very long time. He also expanded the Senate to 900 members. And in fact, this particular thing that he did is something that Octavian Augustus is going to take to heart, because he's going to do much the same thing. He won't make it quite so big because that's a little bit too big for Augustus, but he is going to expand it by 100 seats, from 200 to 300, and it's going to be a big part of how he very underhandedly takes control of the Senate without anybody realizing. Because really, Octavian Augustus learns from his uncle and enacts this very same kind of system. I'm going to stack the Senate with my men by adding more members, right? However, interestingly enough, the most lasting reform that Julius Caesar made was a change in the calendar, something that he was introduced to when he was in the Ptolemaic kingdom, that one of those Hellenistic kingdoms, right? The Ptolemies, which were part Greek, part Egyptian, right? Which is what we see with Cleopatra. Right? She was very much more Greek than she was Egyptian, and actually a little bit more Syrian than she was Egyptian and Greek, but that's neither here nor there. But he took the 365-day-a-year calendar from the Egyptians and introduced that into the Roman world, and this would be a very, very important addition to the Roman world, especially when we move into empire, because Julius Caesar really marks the end. In the first triumvirate really marks the end of the Republic. What we see hereafter is going to be the empire when we get into the second triumvirate and the rise of Octavian Augustus Caesar. Really the thing that's going to make that empire possible, that massive expansion, is going to be a much more dedicated and universal system of time. It's going to be necessary in an empire that is so vast to have the same system of time from one end of the empire to another, and it's going to really be a part of how Romans identify themselves, is according to this notion of time. And this is going to be probably one of the most important reforms Julius Caesar makes. Sadly, though, Julius Caesar really pisses the Optimates off. That's the big enemy that he makes. And it's those folks, really a number of members of the Senate led by Cassius and one of his best generals, one of his clients, right? Because Brutus wasn't just his friend, he was a client. He was one of the men who had come up in the army underneath Julius Caesar. And he was one of the people that Julius Caesar made. One of the reasons Brutus was successful is because he had a patron like Julius Caesar. So really, when you say that, when you hear the Et Brute and the famous Shakespeare play about Julius Caesar. This is the reason why this would have been considered such a massive betrayal, because it's a betrayal of the patron-client system that was part of the Mos Maioris. And this is kind of telling, because by the end of the Republic, the Mos Maiorum really had come under massive amounts of tension. And that tension, it's going to take some time to resolve it under the Second Triumvirate, because we're going to see a brief period of civil war before Julius Augustus Octavian, who is nephew via adoption. This is one of those adopted children, right? Comes into power at the tender age of just barely 16. He only has a peach fuzz on his face, but already he is an intelligent and gifted young man. He was taught from a very young age by his uncle as his patron military tactics and strategies. He was taught many different languages, and he's going to use all of this knowledge to radically reshape the Roman Republic into the Roman Empire. Now, I know this was a little bit longer a lecture than we're used to, but the reason I'm giving a little bit longer a lecture on this one is because these two chapters are going to be really important for your secondary source analysis, right? It's going to be very important for you guys on your secondary source analysis to kind of get these big ideas so you can compare and contrast the Republic and the Empire. That's why I have so many moments where I'm like, this is going to be different in the Empire. This is going to be different in the Empire, to give you that kind of idea. This is what we kind of want to focus on, these kind of comparison points. When we come back to class on Saturday and begin to talk about or, if you're one of my other classes that's listening to this, when you come back to class to discuss Chapter 6, or if you hear Chapter 6 on a lecture as well because you're in some other class with a different time schedule, really concentrate on the major differences in some of these values and some of these practices and the ladder of offices in the plebeian assembly, right? The way that these changed, even ideas of space, the way they changed from the Republic to the Empire. Well, I really look forward to seeing you guys again, and for further reading, I would super suggest some of these really great books. All of these books, by the way, are available on Google Scholar. Every single one of them, or Google Books for preview. Now, if you want to choose, if you're having trouble finding an article for your research project proposal in your annotated bibliography, do keep in mind that if you find a book that has a particularly awesome chapter, I will take a particularly awesome chapter as an academic article if you do the work and make sure that you tell me what the overall thesis of the book is. You have to at least give me an idea of what the overall thesis of the book is and not just the article. But that can be done. So if you have any issues, if you hit a wall, it's something to keep in mind. But it's also something to keep in mind for your book review when that's coming up, because you're going to start wanting to go out there and looking for your book review and starting to read that now. So you have time to get that read in time for your book review. You don't want to have to read it all in one day and then write it all in one day. So it's best to kind of time this stuff out, especially since for the book review, you have to find an academic review for that as well out there. It's good to start doing that legwork now. So if you have problems, you can talk to me. Okay, super duper guys. I will see you back here for Chapter 6. Thanks for listening to the lecture.